Good morning. We're here today for another edition of the Boom Project Book YouTube channel. And our special guest is Margo Taft Stever today. I'm Bonnie Johnson and Kimberly Crum. We have put together an anthology called the Boom Project that is available at all regular outlets. And it is a compilation of stories, essays, poetry from writers who are baby boomers also. And so we're honored to have Margo Stever here with us, who lives in Sleepy Hollow, New York, is one of the writers featured in this book, but we wanted to talk with her and get to know her better. And we wanted you to have the opportunity to get to know her as well. So welcome, Margo. So glad you're here. I think Kimberly's going to read your bio, and then we'll talk a little and have you read for us. So, Kim?
Yes. Margo Taft Stever, featured in the Boom Project book, her poem, Queen City, about her Cincinnati, Ohio hometown. This poem's also included in her book, Cracked Piano by CavanKerry Press, which she'll be talking about, I think, a little bit today. Margo is currently an adjunct assistant professor in the Bioethics Department of the School of Medicine at Case Western University in Cleveland. Recently, she developed a course on bioethics and poetry, which I hope she'll talk a little bit about because I'm trying to understand how those two work together. Stever also teaches a poetry workshop at a residential school for at-risk children and adolescents called Children's Village. She is founder of the Hudson Valley Writers Center and founding and co-editor of Slappering Press. She's going to have to just explain that name to us. Much of Stever's time, Margo's time, is spent in editing work for the Slappering Press. She will soon publish an anthology also titled I Want to Be Loved by You, Poems on Marilyn Monroe, edited by Susanna H. Case and herself. This will be published early next year by Milk and Cake Press, located near Cincinnati, and we're looking forward to seeing that one. Margo's been published many places. Her full-length poetry collection is Cracked Piano, shortlisted and received honorable mention for the 2021 Eric Hoffer Award Grand Prize. And also The End of Horses is a forthcoming book from Broadstone Books in 2022. She co-authored Looking East, William Howard Taft and the 1905 U.S. diplomatic mission to Asia. That seems to be a bit of a departure from poetry. I like that. The Chinese language version of the book was chosen in 2013 as the Book of the Year for International Cooperation and Promotion by Zhejiang University Press. And Margo is also a tennis champ in her local community and has a grandchild or two, and seems to keep her days busy. So welcome, Margo.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I should just mention Slappering Press comes from Sleepy Hollow, which is where I live and have lived since the 1980s, the early 80s. And we wanted to call the press Sleepy Hollow Press, but that name was already taken. So we looked at Dutch iterations of the name, since this was an early Dutch settlement. And Slappering Hall was one of the iterations of Sleepy Hollow. So it just seemed like a nice name for a press.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yes.
I'm sure I mispronounced it, but that backstory is terrific. So we're all going to look. Can you tell us what Slappering Press does? Yeah.
Well, the mission of the press has always been to publish poetry by poets who have not previously published a book or chapbook. And since 1990, we have published an annual chapbook, and we have a contest, and anyone's allowed to, invited to submit. And we have guidelines on the Hudson Valley Writers Center website, www.writerscenter.org. and the contest deadline is usually around May 15th. So then we started doing another series in which we choose a master woman poet who chooses an emerging woman poet to appear in the same chapbook. And there's an interview at the end. And we chose to do women poets because we feel that, as has been shown from statistical studies, women are not published as easily or frequently as men. So that was our reason for choosing those. And this year we have Dorian Laux, L-A-U-X, and Leela Chatty, who is an Ohio poet, a wonderful young Ohio poet, we are going to be publishing their chapbook. It'll probably come out early next year.
Oh.
And we're really, it's titled Mothers.
Ooh,
and I'm very excited about it. and they're both wonderful poets. So I hope you all will take a look at that when it's out.
And your heart's being back to your Cincinnati home, your Cincinnati origin, right?
Right. Yeah.
And tell us the website again for the writing organization.
The website is writerscenter.org.
Okay.
It's Writers Center, one word, .org. We were lucky to get that address. It's the Hudson Valley Writers Center. If you put that in the search bar, you can also get it, the Hudson Valley Writers Center.
Thank you.
And the center has an incredible reading series that Jennifer Franklin has developed during the pandemic to be really an international series, but certainly national. We used to be more regional or, local, but now it has taken off, and we have amazing writers from all over the United States, the best writers in the country, reading for us. And I really think everyone should check it out because it's an incredible series.
Is that online? Is the series?
It's online. It's on, yes. And we started to do the first hybrid, although we're really going, I think, further into it. The Writers Center will go further into it in January. We have only done a few hybrid just to sort of get our foot in the water, but we're definitely going in that direction so we don't lose, all the wonderful audience that we've been able to.
Yeah. Oh,
but the readings are just incredible. I really hope that everyone will check out the website.
Well, you and Bonnie and I will.
Good.
So Bonnie has the first question for you, and then it'll be time for you to share your work with us.
Well, I was going to ask for all of us collectively to tell us about your writing journey, when you started writing and how long you've been at it, any pointers or things that you use as a muse. That everybody's always interested in your muse. And I'm somewhat skeptical of muses at times, but for those who haven't, we want to know about their practice.
Well, I guess I would say, first of all, you had asked me 6 words to describe my writing philosophy, and I said that I had 2 words that I repeated 3 times. And so I'll start with that: music, meaning, music, meaning, music, meaning. And the reason why I thought especially the meaning part might be important is that it seems to me these days in many poems that I've read, the meaning, at least as far as I can discern, sometimes gets short shrift. And I think it is definitely equally important, but equally important with lyricism. I think they're both critical to creating a poem. And, that doesn't mean there aren't some prose poems that can be, there are all sorts of different kinds of poems, but those are the 2 that I think are the most important in my own philosophical vision. But as
talking about music, you're talking about the lyricism of the line and
yes, and the rhythm and the sound, and yes.
Music,
yeah.
I love it.
But just as far as writing, I was interested in writing, I think throughout my life. I used to write stories that my father would get his secretary to type up, which is interesting. I was born in the 50s, so this was quite a while ago. And then I just continued to be interested in writing. I was co-editor of the high school newspaper. And then when I went to college, I submitted poems to try to get into Denise Levertoft's poetry workshop that she was teaching at MIT. She was particularly interested in teaching scientists, which I was definitely not, but I really wanted to work with Denise Levertov. And I was so, and I, at that time, I had done a lot of writing. I would say a lot of it sort of tortured writing of teenager, but I didn't necessarily think what I was writing. I didn't really think I could write a poem. I just wrote, but I submitted some of that writing, and she actually believed that it was poetry. So that was the first time that I thought I could write poetry, and I started to gain confidence in my ability to be able to write a poem. And the workshop was probably the key formative experience of my life, because from that time onward, my life moved in the direction of trying to create the poet's life and be a poet. And it was, it was a bumpy journey, and it was not all in one direction, and it's still not. And yeah, I guess throughout my life, I've always tried to incorporate doing things in the world as well as writing. So not just to write my own work, but to try, like for instance, create the Hudson Valley Writers Center, Slappering Hall Press. I created a writing workshop, a literacy workshop at a homeless shelter that was extremely significant in my own life as one of the really major experiences that I had, and that kind of thing. So I've always tried to do both, which has slowed down my production, I think. And I've never been, people have said to me they think I'm prolific, but I'm really extraordinarily slow, like a snail, in terms of my production of work. But I guess I was really lucky that, one thing Denise did is she wrote a letter that allowed me to get off campus. And I was a student at Harvard, but I was able to get off campus. It was then called Radcliffe, and then it became Harvard by the time I graduated. So it's hard to say whether I was at Radcliffe or Harvard, but I was able to get off campus my freshman year. And she said I was living with her and studying poetry, but I was living with a band of musical band called the Modern Lovers. And we had this awful apartment on the corner of Putnam and Western. And one of the band members became a member of the Talking Heads, Jerry Harrison. And the band itself, the Modern Lovers, was one of the early punk rock bands. So it was an important experience just to be part of that, but also to be able to, I don't think I would have thrived on campus. I just lived in a kind of chaotic family life growing up, and just the organization of having to be in a dormitory and going to cafeteria every day. I don't know. I never did. I don't think I went to the cafeteria. Maybe I went once, but I have no recollection.
So you were a traditional student having a non-traditional education.
Yes, and it was all because Denise Levertov was such an incredible mentor.
Wow.
And then I also have to mention that after I got married, my husband and I lived in New Hampshire, where he was living in Concord, New Hampshire. He worked for the New Hampshire Attorney General's office. And I got to know, he knew Victor Cuman, who was Maxine Cuman's husband. And so I got to know Maxine Cuman, and that was another incredibly important experience for me, just being able to work with her. I actually worked briefly as a secretary for both Denise and Maxine, not long-term at all, but it was just being able to go visit Maxine. She loved horses, which I did too. Horses are always an animal with whom I have identified tremendously. And she was just totally, and she was also someone who really believed the physical part of you is inextricably important in your writing even. And she was just like an Amazon woman. She had such a capacity to, when she rode, she could ride farther. She just had this amazing ability to swim, ride, do whatever she could do better than anybody in terms of her strength and that kind of thing. So anyway, so that's sort of a beginning idea of my beginning of how I got started being a writer, I would say.
I think that's fascinating. What do you say, Bonnie?
I think so too. And now we would like to hear some of your own words.
Great. Well, I thought I'd read some poems first from the book Crack Piano, which CavanKerry Press published in 2019. And there are a bunch of poems in the book about Ohio. So I wanted to focus on those since this, and one of them is, of course, the anthology poem. But this one's titled, Why So Many Poets Come from Ohio.
That's good.
Some say El Nino blows them over the Rockies, and poets pool like guppies, grounded by the plains, hollowed into Ohio. How easy it is to forget the nameless places along the scant, unremarkable rivers, the burning, polluted creeks. Even horses pull themselves back from the earth to ignore where they were born. Why poets come from Ohio explains why shopping malls are built to last only decades, why deer end up dead on I-80. Poets come from Ohio because of the homelessness of the hills, how they are low and huddled, as if long ago glaciers ran out of energy on the alluvial plain, leaving them unstated, looking westward for relief. Poets who wish to intone come from Ohio because nothing happens, only the sonorous gestation of their interiors. They search the soured hills for daffodils, for turnips, for everything they thought once grew there.
Whoa.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing
wow.
that. There's
But-
so many lovely images.
Mhm.
Thank you. Well, I was stunned by the number of poets who have come from Ohio, important poets like James Wright, who happens to be one of my favorite poets of all time. So that was sort of the reason for writing that poem.
It was beautiful. It was, very moving in the way that, you're from a home, but the horses, even horses pull themselves, didn't get the whole thing, away
Back from the
home.
earth. Back from the earth.
I love that. And how essentially that the interiors survive because there's nothing else to challenge the exterior, which of course is an exaggeration, but wonderful. Really wonderful images and music. There was music in that. I was listening for it and I heard it.
Thank you.
Other low and huddled, the
The
sun.
homelessness of the hills
Mhm.
struck me too, and the poets gather like guppies. That was there was so much in that, and it even had a little environmental twist in there too with the burning.
Yeah. And that actually, this era is somewhat removed from the time in Ohio where things like that were happening, actually. So it came from, it was closer to that time when things were so polluted. And I think it's a little better now, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Do.
Oh yeah.
Well, we would like to hear more. Do you have another?
Yeah, I'd like to read the poem that's in the Boom Project anthology. And it's about the city where I grew up, Cincinnati. Queen City. Coming back to Cincinnati, a wayward soul looking for a sign. I see the city stretching out like a forsworn promise. The next thing to cleanliness, the thing next to cleanliness, Cincinnati. Post to Procter & Gamble, the smut buster, skyline chili. I now return like a blind man inhabiting a woman's body, an alien within an alien, hopelessly lost, sensing Cincinnati will always be foreign. The city will always catapult me to a childhood endlessly spinning out of control. Cincinnati, a city of fountains, squares, new buildings I will never recognize. What is your plan? Returning to the once great Queen City, riverboat town, gateway to the south, I find ghosts of the Underground Railroad, Maplethorpe, race, riots, boycotts. Cincinnati, where crows combed the outlying fields in awful stillness, and dogs barked as if they alone knew their voices echoed for miles down hollows. Where are you now? Where is the Cincinnati filled with concrete strength, suppressed love, waiting breath? This city of my youth with everything opening, where smells of spring meant daffodils covered whole hillsides with yellow, city once called Porkopolis, where hordes of pigs pushed pedestrians off streets, once trashed by Francis Trollope. Why am I coming back to you, land restlessly stolen, abandoned in adolescent despair, vanished island, lost promise of light?
Oh.
Whoa. We know why we wanted that in the book, but we were only able to hear us read it aloud and not hear you read it aloud.
That gave me chills because of its deeper meaning. Thank you. Can we have more?
Sure, and I definitely, if you haven't read Frances Trollope's writing about Cincinnati, I definitely recommend it. She was an incredible woman whose life is worth reading about.
One of the things I noticed before we move on is how there are two things that poem accomplishes for a reader who's not a poet like myself. And that is, we learn something about the poet who refers to her childhood catapulted from all the chaos of her childhood and her painful adolescence. So there's this feeling of the leaving and the coming back, but also there's so much history of the city in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much more pleasant for me to learn about the city that way than to read a long prose piece about.
Yeah. Well, I became so interested. I mean, I did leave. Everyone I have 15 brothers and sisters. My mother was married 3 times and every one of them left. Well, actually, not all of them left Ohio. I think one is still left. And Bob Taft, who was governor of Ohio, was one of my stepbrothers and he's still there.
Oh.
But every other of the 14 left. And I left and thought, I'll never come back. I'll never come back to Ohio. But then later, maybe starting 20 years ago, I started to love Cincinnati and especially the early history. I mean, I'm more interested in the early history of the city, but I'm really very interested in Cincinnati and I really miss it. And, so I just totally changed. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me now and then. I felt that then, but even hearing you read it is terrific.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say that part of this book is also about my great-grandfather, Peter Rawson Taft, who was a half-brother of William Howard Taft.
Oh.
And his letters are preserved in the W.H. Taft papers. And I discovered them doing historical research. And he became a disappeared person. So I hadn't heard anything about him. In 1867, he graduated first in his class from Yale, and also the best student at Yale had graduated to that date because all the students took classics and they got a numerical grade. So if nothing else, he was a workaholic. We must realize that. But 3 months after he graduated, he got typhoid fever, almost died, and never fully recovered. And that could be because he took calomel, which had mercury in it, which many people were given for bad diseases like the one he had, or maybe his brain swelled and he had terrible headaches. And I think he may have even lost his vision in one eye, and it just didn't get better. I think he had some kind of continuing infection, which was not uncommon to have a continuing bacterial infections during those days without antibiotics, which we're so lucky to have now. So many of the poems in this collection are about the thin line between sanity and insanity. He was committed to the Cincinnati Sanitarium, private hospital for the insane, for a short time, but it was long enough to destroy his life. And he writes in this book about, in this book, I have a number of letters that he wrote, which I made into found poem. This poem that I'm going to be reading next is not one of them. This is my poem, but he did write in one of his letters that he had gone to a lunatic ball. And these were there was an attempt to be humane towards mental patients in those days. So they would have lunatic balls for the patients, and spectators were sometimes invited.
That would not be a politically correct name to call the ball, I don't think today. But
Right, or being
very
in an,
descriptive.
and also being committed to an insane asylum would be a little bit difficult to overcome in your life if you, anyway. So this is the lunatic, the title of the poem is The Lunatic Ball, and it's after Dance in a Madhouse, a painting by George Bellows, who lived from 1882 to 1925. Furious dancing gives way to screams. 5 men stare ghoulish at the wall. This is a lunatic ball. The best student Yale had ever seen, 3 months after graduation, typhoid, brains swelled inside his skull. They dosed out calomel. 5 ghosts appeared in a mercury dream, headaches unbearable. This is a lunatic ball. Married 1 year, baby the next. His wife filed for release. The medical textbooks he gleaned, futile, endless stall. A woman names her baby doll Christ, lurches, leans. A building in an earthquake, then she crawls. This is a lunatic ball. One man plays a flute, calls himself Faunus. Another uses an invisible latrine. Attendants haul out a wild man in a straitjacket on a wooden beam. A woman growls like a bear. This is a lunatic ball. Behind a glass wall, well-dressed spectators riveted sit amused. Looking at them, the patients know they are through. Spectacled men sport great coats, and laced up women make jokes in the shimmering hall.
Whoa. How visual is that, and powerful.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Well, Peter was a lawyer, and he actually it was so eerie. I was somehow on eBay, which I'm never on anymore, but I was, and there was a medical textbook signed by him. In other words, and it was definitely his signature, because I know what his signature looks like. So he was trying to read medical textbooks to figure out what was wrong with him. And of course, in those days, doctors had no idea what they were doing. So no, there was no way that he could ever figure out what to do or what he had or anything. So it's very sad.
It is very sad. I have a question, Margo, that is so visual with so much detail. And I'm wondering how much research you did to reconstruct that, or was that speculative, imaginative all by itself, which either is fine, by the way.
Well, I think a lot of it is imaginative, but I did do a lot of reading. And that was one thing that I was going to say in terms of craft tips that I would definitely recommend, which is doing research on whatever it is, whatever poem. I mean, obviously some poems just come for me, it's very infrequent that a poem just comes from, out and is done. I mean, that's really very infrequent, but sometimes if you want to write about a topic, it's really important to figure out what's known about it. And I was amazed to find that during this period that Peter was hospitalized, there was a huge number of people hospitalized because of the Industrial Revolution. There was it had this effect of, making, I don't know, people ending up in mental hospitals. I mean, there was a huge increase in the number of people hospitalized. But I mean, some of the details, a lot of the details in this poem I made up, but I mean, if you look at George Bellows' painting, you can get a really beautiful visual interpretation of what a lunatic ball was like. And I did read that people in some places, I don't know about Cincinnati, but that people were allowed to go and watch the lunatic ball, so-called sane people were allowed to go and watch the crazy people try to dance together. And during this, Peter, they had during this humanistic movement, they did things also like allowing people to garden, which is a great idea, I think. Yeah. But, it wasn't all bad, but it definitely wasn't all good.
So
So-
did this ancestor of yours, did he die in the,
No, he got out. I don't think he was there for very long, but his wife filed. See, I think that he was very smart. And I think that he realized that if he divorced his wife had, my grandfather was their only child. And he knew that if he divorced her, their life would be ruined. So he let her, this is my guess. I don't know if it's true, but my guess is that he let her divorce him, so he was divorced. And I mean, he lived alone in an apartment. And actually, I've had some letters from that time too. And I think there was some big explosion near a courthouse, which something fell into his apartment from the explosion. I can't remember too well, but anyway, so he lived by himself. And I don't know, I think it must have been very hard for the Taft family too, to deal with, this whole reality of having someone who had kind of fallen into the dark and trying to, present themselves. I mean, I think insanity was such a negative thing in those days. Not that it is that much better today, but it just was a terrible aspersion. So I'm sure they would want to distance themselves, and it must have been extremely difficult for everyone.
well, that was quite fascinating poem.
Thank you.
And the fact that it's based on family history makes it even more interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, I should just mention he was diagnosed as neurasthenic. And that was a diagnosis, which was really bogus diagnosis. It was given to so many people, like Teddy Roosevelt. That's why Teddy Roosevelt ended up with trying to be this super masculine hero figure, because he was diagnosed as neurasthenic early in his life. His mother was diagnosed as neurasthenic. And one of the sort of attributes of what they thought a neurasthenic was someone who worked too hard, but didn't get results. And I think he tried to practice during one of the busts, how they were boom and bust economies. And when he continued to practice even after he was hospitalized, but, obviously in a not such a great scale, but anyway, it was just a bogus diagnosis. And that was what his diagnosis was.
Yeah.
And his mother, he had asthma or something. And that's why people with asthma were diagnosed as neurasthenic. People, they just put everything in this category of neurasthenia.
Kind of a neurotic something,
Well, it's not even neurotic. It was more physical. I don't know. I mean, maybe both. I don't know. It was a lot of stuff. You could just throw almost anything in and say, well, he or she's neurasthenic. And that was a very bad thing to be. You want to avoid that.
Poetry can give us history or a window into another time, which you've done a couple times.
Yeah.
Are you ready for another poem?
Sure. I'd like to read one about where I live now. This one is, I wanted to read it because it's close to Halloween. And this poem is inspired by another local legend besides Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But it's a legend in Sleepy Hollow, where I've lived since the 1980s. Raven's Rock, Sleepy Hollow, New York. Ichabod the Headless Horseman, rolling hills, the highlands, villages where men tarry at the bars, sleepy towns, Beekman Town, Tarry Town. But who has heard of 3 young women who lost their way in separate incidents many years apart, who took shelter at Raven's Rock and perished in the night? Who knows why they walked the tree-frozen road, their fingers burnt with cold? 3 figures in white, their ethereal, shrill pitch unbearable, gesturing as if the swirling snow, eddies of snow, snow rivers could be human, as if something totally frozen could be alive. What is a raven but a bird? A ghost but a raven bird, and the ghost of 3 women ravenous, waiting at Raven's Rock for a single man to pass by. And did they vent their age for, did they vent their rage for ages of wrongness, for the unrequited, the undone love love forced upon them, jealous love, hardening them. These women by the Hudson, now still, now irrevocably gone.
Ooh, ooh, funny.
My Halloween poem.
Yes, yes. Wow.
That's-
A lot of the poems actually in this collection, aside from being about sanity and insanity, are about the role of mothers and subjugation of women. And so that's another thematic core of the book.
Well, I like how you moved from the Ichabod Crane to, but who has heard of three young women?
Yeah.
yeah.
I like that motion that it, it puts us there, and we remember Ichabod Crane.
Yeah.
Women waiting, raging for ages of whatever came, because I can't I can't write as fast as you speak. So is there a story of three women?
Yes, that is a legend, actually. And it's the Ravens Rock is in the Rockefeller State Park Preserve, which is a beautiful place if you're ever in this area to walk around. And it's high on a hill, and I guess it's a legend of three women who froze in the night, and I don't know. So that's sort of a different legend.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. You mean Ichabod Crane's not true? It's not true.
Well, I'm sure I did do that ride.
Pretty scary.
We live across from the old Dutch church, which is where I think he started. And during the pandemic, I did a lot of walking through the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where, which is near the church. And I hope someday I can write a poem about that. It's an interesting place.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Funny comments or a question about that?
I'm fascinated by that legend and wonder if you have written more about it.
That's the only thing. Actually, someone asked me to write a poem about Sleepy Hollow, and I'm very bad at providing creative work, like during a workshop, which I've done.
Oh yeah.
Once in a while, I actually do. It does sometimes really work miraculously, but a lot of times I'm really not good at doing, poems on demand. But this was my poem on demand. And I think the person who asked me for the poem forgot about it or something. I don't know, but I don't remember ever any follow-up, but I was glad to have the poem. So.
Do you remember the prompt?
No, just to write a poem about Sleepy Hollow. That was the prompt. That was all.
Okay. Yeah, well, there's such panache for your town's name because of that one story.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's like, oh, it's totally cool. She lives in Sleepy Hollow. But I think it's even cooler that she lived with the Modern Lovers, even cooler.
Yeah.
The band, that is. So
back in the day. Living in Sleepy Hollow during Halloween time has become a little bit of a chore because it used to be this place was called North Tarrytown, and people didn't really know what it was. But then there are this whole group of people who dedicated their lives to changing the name from North Tarrytown to Sleepy Hollow. And there were people who were just fighting to the bone to keep it North Tarrytown because they went to high school and that was what it was called, and they wanted to stay that way forever. So anyway, the Sleepy Hollow part of the argument prevailed, and now it's Sleepy Hollow, but we have so many people who come here during Halloween. It is just clogged with people, more than, just unbelievable. And we have so much going on and so many trick-or-treaters. You have to get like gallons and gallons of candy.
Do people come dressed up?
And Halloween, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, the folks who come to your town are they coming
sometimes. They don't always walk around in costumes, but every once in a while you see someone in a strange costume. Yeah.
Well, yeah. There's a poem for you, Sleepy Hollow Halloween.
Yeah,
it's sort of a mecca for Halloween aficionados.
It is. It really is. It is. We have a haunted hayride, and we have all sorts of attractions that you can be part of.
Yeah.
So that's probably getting geared up right about this time of
Oh,
year.
yeah. Yeah, historic Hudson Valley has this thing called the Blaze, and they have 40 million pumpkins and they have this whole area where you go and see this incredible display of more pumpkins than you could have possibly imagined existed, and that kind of thing. Yeah, just on and on.
Mm. Well, it sounds like a really good place to either make a beeline for or to avoid altogether at Halloween.
Yeah,
depending
absolutely.
on your particular bent. Tell us about what you do when you're not writing poetry, something that maybe you would like to share. I know you play tennis or have played tennis.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I mean, I did mention it a little bit, but growing up, animals were always a huge part of my life. We had so many animals growing up. We had a lot of children and tons of animals at our house. And I particularly always identified with horses. And so I grew up riding horses, but then I sort of ended up coming back to it after I was a big student radical during the 60s. I ended up riding in the horse show which I gave up in 62. So I did a lot of that. I went to the major horse shows and did the 100 jumper division. I did the 3-foot 100 jumper division for adult amateurs. And I don't know, it's too much to go into what it was all about, but it's very intricate. It's almost like dressage in the way you have to have a kind of precise ability to ride a course with a horse and show the horse off as in flat classes. So it was pretty exciting to be part of that. And I ended up my last year with a horse. I had a horse for many 10 years or whatever, but the last year was our best year, and the year I had to retire because I just had to give it up and move on to other things. But we ended up like 4th in the country for a World Hunter Rider Championship for adult amateur. And no, it was actually for the Northeast region, I should say. And, my horse was Grand Hunter Champion at Lake Placid during the Hunter Rider Week, which is one of the biggest horse shows in the Northeast. And he won everything that year. He's an unbelievable horse. He had to retire recently because he got neurological problems. So I no longer ride. And I started playing tennis in matches at age 62. So I'm never going to be, a really great tennis player, but it's a lot of fun just trying to make progress, which is so much slower when you're older. But it's an exciting enterprise to try to get better at a sport, I think. And it's been a lot of fun just playing with other friends, and it's just a great experience.
Well, and I think fun is certainly an admirable pursuit. So,
well, it can also be grueling, and especially in the heat of this, summers and when you're doing matches. I'm not very good at my biggest problem is just not staying relaxed. And so you really, I think if I started doing this when I was much younger, like 12, I might have been better at staying, but anyway, it's still fun to play with people.
Well, I think it's important for people to hear that, because some people watching this won't be baby boomers, we hope. They'll want to know from the wisdom of the current poets and writers. Yeah. But I think to start something new when you're 62 is an encouragement.
Yes, definitely.
For everybody else. It's like, there isn't like an end point here that we have that much control over. We might as well live until we don't.
Yeah, and I really do ascribe to the philosophy that you have to be active. You shouldn't just be sitting in your chair all day. You have to get up every half an hour and walk around. You have to move, or else you're going to be in trouble, and physically. And so that I feel it's really important. And the discipline of sports is also just like the discipline of anything else.
Yeah. And here we are sitting in chairs. But you speaking of horses, you talked about horses, and is the End of Horses, that's the name of is that new chapbook that you're releasing?
No, it's a book that's coming out with Broadstone Books. And I don't know if you know that press. It's a Kentucky press, so you should definitely get to know it. If you don't know it.
Again?
Broadstone Books.
Oh, yeah.
Larry Moore and others.
Good. You're getting
Yeah.
a Kentucky publisher. Do you have any poems to read from that or other?
Well, I do. The last two poems that I'm going to read are going to be, they were published, the last two poems were published in this chapbook, Ghost Moose, but they're also going to be in The End of Horses. And the poem that I wanted to read next is actually going to be in an anthology that you mentioned that Susanna H. Case and I are editing, titled I Want to Be Loved by You, Poems on Marilyn Monroe, which will be published by that Cincinnati Press, Milk and Cake Press. But it's poems on Marilyn Monroe, and we have over 90 poets represented in the anthology. And we're working so hard to get a poem by Marilyn Monroe herself. And that's the last thing that we're having trouble getting permission for. Macmillan cannot reach the people who are in charge of the permissions. And now we're trying to, like, we just are approaching the Marilyn Monroe fan club and trying, because they know someone who knows someone. So we're just desperately, because our deadline's coming up. And we really want to include one of her poems because people didn't take her seriously then. And, they should at least take her seriously enough to allow her poems to be represented in an anthology of poetry about her. So anyway, I was going to read my poem from the anthology, but I did want to mention that in my book, I have a note to Dear Reader note, which is that it may sound like I'm dyeing my hair now, but I just want to tell you that I'm not dyeing my hair. I grew it out during the pandemic. I used to dye it. So that's why when I wrote this poem, but now to my surprise, it turned white. So you might think I'm dyeing it, but I'm not. So I just want to defend myself.
It's very attractive. I did the same thing. I used to dye mine, and I quit during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it, because it was turning lighter, then I would color it anyway. So
yeah, I like your hair. I mean, my hair when I grew it out wasn't that different than it was when I was dyeing it, which was such a shock to me. I thought it was going to be sort of stone gray. But
Marilyn
anyway.
Monroe hair now.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Perfect for the anthology. When is it
exactly.
coming out?
It's coming out in probably by February. We're hoping to get it out by February.
Well, we'll look for it.
Thank you.
Which poem are you reading?
Beauty Parlor.
Oh.
A pedicurist clips a hangnail from a client's big toe, while Monsieur Marc, cultivated Belgian, whittles away at her hair. He praises her Botox, only 5 injections, her face now full and taut. In 1905, blondined hair was scandalous. Over a century later, I'm trying to make mine as platinum as possible, bleach out, then blend with the gray growing in, cut down on visits and cost. While I stamp out outward signs of age, my stylist, a striking woman who was recently a man, talks about her boyfriend in a soft, masculine voice. On the corner below at Lex and 28th, we observe a woman, blonde hair straggling like Marilyn's on her way down. But this woman's roots have grown in 3 inches of black. What a shame, exclaims Monsieur Marc. The woman stumbles, gropes the trash can, body bent over, off balance. Oddly leaning, she careens, wobbles into the street. Bus brakes screech. She hawks green phlegm. Must be on crack, says one client. Monsieur Marc wonders, why doesn't she do something with her hair?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's the biggest problem she has. I love that last line.
That's a wonderful twist.
I love it. Yes. So this is in current time, but reflecting on the 1918, I think you say.
Well, I mean, dyeing your hair, what they call having blondined hair in the 1900s was really, you were like a floozy, you would be considered a, I don't know, like a whore or something. I mean, it was not a good thing if anyone accused you of having blondined hair, which of course these days is no longer the case with most people.
There's no limits to colors. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's still those people like my husband who was always on my back for me to stop dyeing my hair because he thought it was bad for, it was like caused cancer or something. But I don't know.
What an interesting poem. An entry into Marilyn Monroe via the hair and the attitudes of, yeah.
Well, the way the anthology was born is Susanna H. Case, who's a wonderful poet and has published many poems. And she's also she publishes with Broadstone Books. Her next collection is coming out in 2022 with Broadstone Books. And she just also published Dead Shark on the N Train with them. And it's a great book. But so what happened was we were reading in a Zoom reading, and we both read poems that mentioned Marilyn Monroe. And Susanna came up with this idea, which it turned out to be good timing because this 2022 is the 60th year after her death. So it's a good time it's also interestingly, they have this big movie coming out next year, which is titled Blonde, I think. And that's going to be a big, I guess we aren't the only thing that's happening.
It'd be a good year for Marilyn Monroe multimedia events.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you come to Kentucky, we're here.
So where do you live in Kentucky?
We both live in Louisville.
Oh, wow.
Which is on the river and is the gateway to the South as well.
Well, the psychiatrist who did the introduction for crack piano, Jess Wright, is a professor at, do you know him?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Because he was my husband's best friend, one of his best friends in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. And that's how he knew Jess Wright.
Of the cognitive behavioral therapy movement.
Yeah.
I worked in a psych clinic with him.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Because he knows a lot about depression, I guess.
Yeah. Hopefully not personally, but.
No, I don't mean personally. I don't know about that, but
that's wonderful. So. Connections are wonderful.
Yeah.
So do you have one more poem?
Yes, I do. I wanted to read the title poem for my new collection, and many of the poems in the End of Horses are about the sixth extinction, which of course is one of the greatest mass extinctions in the history of the earth, but the only one created by humans, and which we are having the unfortunate reality of living through at this moment. And this is a projection to the future. End of Horses. I write to you from the end of the time zone. You must realize that nothing survived after the horses were slaughtered. We sleep below the hollow, burned out stars. We look into dust bowls searching for horses. When you walk in the country, you will be shocked to meet substantial masses on the road. We do not know whom to accuse or where the horses were driven, who slaughtered them or for what purpose. Had the horses slept under the linden trees, the generals and engineers pucker and snore on the veranda.
Oh, okay. Oh, so I was right. It's like a direct address. It's written like that, and there's the we pronoun.
Yeah, it's almost like a letter in a way to someone. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the epistolary poems are really beautiful. Ezra Pound's The River Merchant's Wife is such a beautiful poem. If you want to read a beautiful epistolary poem, that is one of my favorite poems. You were talking about
Ezra Pound.
Ezra Pound, yeah. The
And it's,
River Merchant's Wife.
I'll read that. Yes.
But I've done a lot of, this is not a purely epistolary poem, but I've done a number of epistolary poems in which in this, my new book, there's a poem titled Beloved Child, and it's written by my great-great-grandmother as she's dying. She wrote this letter to her 2-year-old child. It was just so breathtakingly beautiful. I had to make it into a found poem, which I did.
Oh,
But a lot of the poems in Crack Piano are also epistolary poems that I made from letters that Peter wrote, which I think are very interesting and give a really good view into how, mental patients were treated, so-called mental patients were treated during that time.
So when you talk about an epistolary poem, it not necessarily is not a letter, but it's based on letters.
Well, it actually, it actually can be a letter,
Okay.
a poem made out of a letter.
Okay.
And that's what a lot of them are, or you could be some extrapolation from that, I suppose.
Great new idea, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not new, but I've not heard that before, writing poems from existing letters.
It's really an interesting discipline you can look into. It's almost like a form. And if you look it up, you'll find a lot of interesting poems that are epistolary it was one of in this workshop that I created at Case Western Reserve. And it was an introductory poetry workshop as well as bioethics and poetry. And I did talk about epistolary poems as one of the, kind of areas. But that was another thing about craft ideas that I wanted to mention, is the idea of trying new things, not just because, I grew up in the 60s when everyone hated form and I hated form, and everyone wrote free verse and I wrote free verse. And now people are so fascinated with form, and everyone is creating new forms and doing forms and old forms and everything like that. And I don't have enough confidence to really go into form writing with much vigor, but I do recommend it, especially in the beginning of the writing. Learn about form, see if you can do it. You might be so surprised at what you can do. And there's so many interesting Japanese forms that people like the Haibun and just that people have brought back these days that are just so interesting.
Yeah, form making it simpler for somebody who's not a poet to actually attempt a poem, because it sets boundaries on your words. Right.
It's kind of like a prompt. It's a really great prompt to try to adhere to some kind of form. And one other thing, which I'm sure everyone has said to you is as a tip for writing, is the notebook, which I'm totally disorganized, and I've kept notebooks, but I've never dated them. So I never even know, but I found in this, in this era of mine, I can go back and write a poem from some of the notebooks that I kept in the 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I would really suggest keeping notebooks, but dating them, because that's one of the worst things for me, is that I don't know unless I can really figure it out by something in the notebook. But anyway, keeping notebooks and not trying to say, really just let yourself write, and you'll end up writing about what you really care about. But don't censor what you're writing. Just write whatever you can, whatever comes to your mind, and try to really. That was another thing that Denise Levertov said to me, which is actually in a poem that I included in my upcoming book. But a poem is a gift, but if you're not there for it, it will never be given to you. You have to be there for the poem to, come to you. And I know you were thinking about writer's block. That was one of the questions. And I think if you do keep a notebook and just write, you will not worry about writer's block. You will just write write about what you did, write about what you thought about, write about all those things that, you care about, and write in ways that are lyrical, that are not like received language that everyone's, you can use any language you want. But anyway, it's really important to be there. And I'm not as disciplined, like right now, I'm not in a period where I'm just doing so much and babysitting, and just, I'm not writing very well, but discipline is so critical to production of writing.
Now I have one final question, and that is regarding the music of your writing. What inspires the music of the words and the rhythm of the language for you? Do you have a technique that you use?
Well, I don't have a technique, but I think that if you do, again, provide yourself with the time to sit down and write, and if you, don't try to, I think censorship is really what keeps people from finding their own voice or finding their own music, because if you're like, oh God, I can't say that, or that's stupid, or, I don't want to say that because so-and-so would think that, or, whatever, just don't do that. Just allow yourself to write, and to write what you care about and what you're worried, write about what's happening in the world with climate change and what's happening to animals, or write about animals, or write about something that you really care about, and allow yourself. If you do research, you can find a lot of amazing vocabulary related to that topic. And there's so many incredible words that are, so beautiful that you might not think about, that you can just, kind of steal through your research. The words, and it's just, I don't know.
It's there. Be there for all those words.
There's also the whole study of conversation, and some poets have done such an incredible job using conversation, many of conversations that they may have heard themselves, but that's such a great part, can be such a great part of poetry. It's not that easy to incorporate effectively, but it can be such a great part of poetry.
Yeah. Well, Southern idiom is a wonderful lyrical tool as well. That, you read more like a Toni Morrison. There's so much music in her writing, and part of it is because of what you're saying, the conversation, and the idioms, and
absolutely,
hyphenated words. Well, we've gone our full time, and now I think it's time, as our poet advises, that we get up and walk around very soon. Keep
run
our
around the block
in shape. And so, Bonnie, do you have any final comments or thoughts?
No, we just thank you so much. I've been charmed listening to you talk and read. So we appreciate your time and sharing with us.
Well, the questions that you asked were wonderful, and I really appreciated being able to think about them. Thank you.
Good,
thank you.
Good. Well, I want to just thank Margo Taft Stever for being here today with us. And you can learn more about her by going to margotaftstever.com. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Margo, of course, remember, is spelled Margo. And you can also find out more about the Boom Project book and by going to theboomproject.com, which is our website, where you can actually buy the book if you like, or on Amazon. And I think Margo's website probably has some information on where you can buy her books. Is that correct, Margo?
Yes. And I think they're available on Amazon, at least, or else, from the publisher. But I think you can get them on my website too.
Well, and enjoy, everybody, the literary life. And I hope that you've taken some messages from this that you can use in your own writing. That is the audience for our YouTube channel. And thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
You too.